Ayotte, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people, and it's now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We are their guests and need to be better guests in solidarity with their struggles and the ongoing injustices they suffer. First Nations history of the residential school system, cultural genocide, and the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls give rise to similar health issues, which we at CCVT, Canadian Centre for Victims of Torture, deal with regarding the impact of genocide, torture, rape as an instrument of war, and human and sex trafficking. CCVT stands in solidarity with Indigenous people and communities, and we have much to learn from their lived experiences. I would also like to acknowledge that we're all treaty people, including those of us who came here as settlers, as migrants, either in this generation or in generations past, and those of us who came here involuntarily as refugees as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. We honor the original intent of the two-row wampum and are committed to foster respectful relations with Indigenous communities as we pursue the truth and reconciliation effort. For me, as a guest on this land from the Democratic Republic of Congo, I am committed to learning and learning about Indigenous history, about their ongoing struggles, and standing in solidarity with them. And I would like to encourage all of you to take some time on a daily basis, on an ongoing basis, to reflect on your place on this land and to stand in solidarity with Indigenous people and communities. Okay, so welcome, folks. Welcome to our Refugee Rights Day webinar. Refugees are welcome. And is it justice, joy, or sorrow? I know our title said joy and sorrow, but the question we're throwing to you is it joy or sorrow? So we'll find out today in our panel discussion. But before we begin, we'll just do a short poll just to find out what folks understand in terms of Refugee Rights Day. What does it mean, right? And have you heard about Refugee Rights Day? Just take a few seconds to answer that question. Okay. Okay, so we're at 48% yes. Okay, 36% no, and 16%, 17% not sure. Okay, so it's about almost half and half. Just give it a few more seconds. If you haven't responded to the poll, we have about 74 people here joining us. Okay. Okay. So we have now 47% yes, 37% no, and 16% not sure. Okay, so I hope that today's session will give you a better perspective in terms of why we're gathered here. But just in general for folks, so that way you have an idea, is on April 4th, 1985, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that refugee claimants are entitled to an oral hearing in accordance with the principles of fundamental justice and international law. So we mark the Supreme Court decision every year to celebrate advances in the protection of Refugee Rights Day, refugee rights in Canada. But there's a lot that has taken place, especially in the first few weeks. And we have a very good panel today that will engage us in that conversation, specifically in terms of the Safe Third Country Agreement. So we have the next item here is a message from our Toronto Deputy Mayor, Jennifer McKelvey. And if you can please just share that, Jaypreet, that would be great for folks to see.
This month serves as an opportunity. Hello, I'm Deputy Mayor Jennifer McKelvey. April marks Refugee Rights Month, a time to recognize and honor the bravery and perseverance of refugees worldwide. This month serves as an opportunity to reflect on the challenges that refugees face in their journey towards safety. Unfortunately, they are often riddled with various obstacles, including discrimination, exploitation, and violence. We must recognize that refugees have the right to safety, protection, and freedom, as well as the right to seek asylum and be treated with dignity and respect. These individuals contribute immensely to the diversity of our communities and enrich our societies with their unique experiences and cultures. It is therefore our collective responsibility, the responsibility of all governments, but most importantly, the Government of Canada, to work together to ensure their rights are protected and upheld. Let us come together in solidarity with refugees worldwide and strive towards creating a world where everyone can live safely and with dignity. Thank you.
Okay. So that's a message from our Toronto Deputy Mayor, Jennifer McKelvey, who was not able to join us, but has sent us those messages. We also have a City of Toronto Refugee Rights Awareness Month proclamation that we would like to share with you as well before we dive into the panel discussion. Okay. So whereas on April 4th, 1985, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that refugee claimants and asylum seekers in Canada have the right to an oral hearing under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom. This ruling recognized that everyone in Canada has the right to be treated fairly and equally in a court of law. Refugees and asylum seekers are valued Torontonians who make many significant contributions to the social, political, and economic fabric of our city. These diverse contributions help strengthen local communities and emphasize the city's motto, diversity, our strength. The City of Toronto seeks to foster a welcoming and supportive environment for newcomers, refugees, and asylum seekers to settle and thrive in our city through official initiatives such as the Refugee Resettlement Program, Refugee Capacity Plan, and the Toronto Newcomer Strategy 2022-2026. The City of Toronto is committed to promoting fundamental human rights and enhancing the quality of life for refugees and those at risk of experiencing discrimination, racism, or violence. Now, therefore, I, Deputy Mayor, on behalf of Deputy Mayor, Toronto City Council do hereby proclaim April 23rd as Refugee Rights Awareness Month in the City of Toronto. Okay. We'll stop sharing. And as we're celebrating Refugee Rights Month, just to remind folks, if you haven't heard, we will be having a vigil tomorrow, April 4th, at 4:30 p.m., 511 Lawrence Avenue, and that will be at our Minister of Public Safety, Marco Mendocino's office. So we're looking forward to see you all there tomorrow, and I will send another reminder by the end of this panel today. Okay, for the time that you've all been waiting, so we will begin with our speakers. We have three good speakers that will be talking to us today. And the first speaker will be Wendy Ayotte, who is a founding member of Bridges Not Borders. Bridges Not Borders is a local grassroots refugee support group in southern Quebec, helping Roxham Road refugees. This is just a short bio of Wendy. Wendy has been working in the community for many, many years, but just for the sake of time, we decided Wendy sent us a short bio about her. So we'll start off with Wendy. Wendy, I mean, you've been at Roxham, right? And based on the current unfolding situation of Safe Third Country Agreement, can you tell us a little bit about your experience being there?
Thank you, Mbalu, and welcome to everybody today. I just want to point out that we've been going to the Roxham Road in the US for over 5 years, since 2017, where we welcome refugees seeking irregular entry into Canada. And during that time, we've met with refugees from over 20 countries, like people from Haiti, Nigeria, Colombia, Yemen, and Turkey. And the reason that they've been crossing at Roxham Road is because if they enter at an official port of entry, like Le Col or like Port Erie, for example, the Safe Third Country Agreement meant that they would likely be returned back to the United States unless they qualified for an exception. Now, the new protocol to the STCA came into effect on midnight of March 24th with only 8 hours warning, and it extends the STCA across the entire Canadian-US border. It has inflicted short and no doubt longer-term suffering on hundreds of refugees who hope to come here. Many who crossed after the deadline have been since excluded from Canada and returned to the US, and they will never be able to apply for asylum again in their lifetime. So since then, the crossings at Roxham Road have trickled to virtually nothing, but people are still coming, arriving at Plattsburgh in the hope that they will be able to enter Canada. From Plattsburgh, they're being taken directly to the port of entry at Le Col. And when I visited the bus station in Plattsburgh, I met people who had been excluded from Canada or who found out that they had no hope of entry, who were in shock, felt hopeless, some without any money as they'd used all their resources to get there. And when I explained to them that what exclusion means, that they can never apply again for asylum in Canada, I saw their faces really collapse with despair, and many people were crying. They had seen Canada as a safe and welcoming place, but no more. I want to share briefly with you some of the people that I've met at the Plattsburgh bus station. I met 2 men from Afghanistan who had left their country a year ago. They spent months in Brazil and then had to leave Brazil and took the dangerous journey upwards through South and Central America to the US-Mexico border, where they were detained in the United States for some time, eventually being released and now using their last resources to come, attempting to enter Canada. And they too were excluded. And we at Bridges Not Borders purchased bus tickets for them and gave them money for them to travel to Maine, where they are now waiting for a charity in Maine to provide them with temporary shelter. I met a young couple from Venezuela, very young. The woman was 8 months pregnant. They had nothing left. And right now they're in a temporary shelter in New York City. I met a Colombian couple with 2 small children who were waiting in Plattsburgh, hoping to be included in this program of 15,000 people from Latin America that the Prime Minister has said we will accept, but we do not know any details about this program. They have now given up any hope of being included in that program. I met a group of about 10 Kurdish men from Turkey. One was an artist who told me that because of his political activities, his son had been thrown from a 3rd-story window and suffered severe injuries. After getting his son medical care and getting his family to safety, he has fled from Turkey. People have shared their great fears about being abandoned in the United States without a path forward. And Alex will tell us more about the conditions that are facing asylum seekers in the United States. So I just want to conclude by saying this is what Canada has become. We have joined the tribe of nations who are willing to inflict great suffering with failed politically expedient border closure measures. In effect, what we are doing is we are building a fortress Canada upon a foundation of human tragedy. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Wendy, for that. And just a reminder to folks that for any questions, please put it in the Q&A, and please do not put it in the chat box there. Thank you, Wendy, for that. So we'll come back with follow-up questions. Just wanted to give everyone a chance to share some of their thoughts. The next person on our panel would be Katherine Moncada. Katherine is a pre-med student in Toronto. She's a former refugee claimant and was recognized as a refugee convention refugee. So Katherine, tell us a little bit about your experience. I mean, there are folks who will never be able to make it to Canada, make a refugee claim, but you were able to actually come into Canada. Tell us about your experience and how your journey has been so far.
Hello, my name is Katherine Moncada. My family and I were from Nicaragua, and for a number of reasons, we arrived in Canada on September 2018. My mom didn't get to come with us at the time. So it was only my dad, my two siblings, and myself. We crossed Luxembourg, the border, and we fortunately had my dad's sister, so my aunt, who lived in Quebec. So we stayed after the whole process of crossing the border and just being there, filling out paperwork. I was 17 at the time. I'm about to turn 22 now. So it's been a while. So after the whole process, and we lived with my aunt for a couple months in Quebec, where my siblings and I went on full-on French immersion. After that, on May 2019, we moved to Ontario, Mississauga, and here is where we reside right now. It has been quite some changes. It was not until 2020, I believe, that we received a letter for a hearing, which was rescheduled like 2 or 3 times due to COVID reasons and many other factors. And my mom just arrived in Canada this November of 2021, almost 4 years after, which was very exciting. And we received our permanent residency this 2021, beginnings of the year.
Okay. Thank you, Katherine, for sharing that. Okay. Okay. So the next panel would be Alex. Alex, Professor Alexander Vernon directs the Immigration Law Clinic at the University of Detroit Mercy, where students assist people fleeing for their lives, struggling for family unity, and striving to regularize their status in the United States. Living in Windsor, Ontario, Professor Vernon crosses the border most days of the week, and as do many of his Canadian clinical students participate in the dual JD program offered in conjunction with the University of Windsor Faculty of Law. Given their geographic location, Professor Vernon and his students have a unique experience of how the Safe Third Country Agreement between Canada and the United States impacts the lives of refugees. So Professor Vernon, for you, I mean, we're looking for insights in terms of the conditions facing asylums in the US. If you can just give us your perspective on this.
Sure. And my perspective is, I wanted to take a deep breath and say, refugees are welcome. And I know that with this group, these are folks that really believe that refugees should be welcome. But as Wendy pointed out, there are changes in law and policy that mean that refugees really are not welcome in Canada. And my role has kind of been as an ambassador. An ambassador to who? To people like you. When I encounter people who've been affected by the Safe Third Country Agreement and these policies that turn them back from Canadian protection, even after they've been on Canadian soil. And so, you know, what happens to some of these people? There's a very high rate of detention in the United States. And certainly that's one way that I've come across people who've been rejected by the Safe Third Country Agreement at the Canadian border is they've been detained while they're pursuing their asylum claims. Other issues that affect people seeking asylum in the United States, I'm going to give you a quick list, which is a bit of a litany, and I hope that your questions will be able to give me an opportunity to expand on these. But there is a time limit. There's a 1-year bar during which people must, with few exceptions, apply for asylum within the United States. And if they miss that deadline, and they may miss that deadline because they don't have access to an attorney, there's no legal aid provided to people with asylum claims in the United States, they may be ineligible for asylum. There are very problematic case precedents in areas such as domestic violence asylum claims or gang-based asylum claims that make it very difficult for people to win asylum. There are policies such as the Remain in Mexico policy, whereby people come to the US border and are forced to remain in the United States for the duration of their refugee claim. The Title 42 COVID health measure that allows the United States to just turn people back after they've crossed into the United States, so they can't even get there in the first place. I'm just kind of looking at my my list of other issues that make it a very dangerous place for asylum seekers trying to come into the United States. You know, I could give you any number of stories of things that have happened to people who've been rejected by Canada and forced to pursue their claims in the United States. There's kind of you know, the ones that I've encountered, I've tried to help. So I've represented them. And so we've had some good outcomes in many cases. We've had people that have eventually won asylum after a long and arduous procedure. They've been detained through part or all of the process. But unfortunately, we've had people that have been deported as well. And, you know, so that's people who have had, I'd like to think of myself as a competent professor and attorney. My law student's quite competent as well. So, you know, keeping in mind that the vast majority of asylum seekers in the United States, and especially those that are detained, don't have adequate access to legal counsel. The grant rates for those folks are very low indeed. So I'll leave it at that for now, as I'm out of time, but I look forward to answering some of these questions in the Q&A. Thank you. There was a message in the chat that there is no Q&A, so I don't know if that...
Yeah, and I see folks already putting it in the chat, so we'll just manage the Q&A. It's actually at the right corner with like little, about 5 or 6 dots. So if you click on it, it will allow you to enter your questions. But if you put it in the chat, that's fine as well. I'll be able to track it if you're not able to find it. And for Professor Vernon, just another follow-up in terms of what happens to people who are returned, to the US, and those who are, let's say, in limbo?
Well, it depends. So unfortunately, some of the people that come to Canada come because they've already lost their claim in the United States. So they may have a deportation order already, and those people are sort of the most at risk of detention and removal from the United States because they've already been through the system. Maybe they didn't get a good break. Maybe they had a judge with a 2% grant rate for asylum, regardless of the quality of their case. Maybe they had a very tough particular social group case that they were trying to try themselves without the help of a lawyer. So those are at the most risk. Even those who came with, say, a visa to the United States, a student or a visitor, if that visa is still on its face valid, when they get returned by Canada to the United States, the American officials are now on notice that this person actually has a fear of going back. And so they're judged to be violators of their visa status. They have no intention of returning. They're put in removal proceedings, and again, at risk of detention. You have to go through the process of fighting for asylum in the United States. And we've also noticed that, and again, it's quite arbitrary, that some people get returned to the United States and they're sort of just released, but often released in limbo, not knowing where and how to make, an asylum application. And to be sure, you don't get a work permit while you're waiting for your asylum case until much further along in the process than you would in Canada. So a lot of these people, lacking the ability to work, lacking any sort of social assistance, rely on the charity of organizations such as our immigration law clinic, or organizations very much like some of the organizations who are on the call, the counterparts in the United States. But otherwise, many people fall through the cracks.
Thank you for that. And so this question will go to Wendy. Wendy, based on some of the exclusion that you mentioned when you spoke, would you elaborate in terms of Canada's humanitarian role? Where do we stand in this?
Well, we're entirely responsible for this humanitarian tragedy. And I mean, the fact that this protocol was implemented with 8 hours warning was so deeply shocking and callous on their part. They clearly had no concern whatsoever for these people who were seeking to come into Canada. They were, I wouldn't even call them second-class refugees. They're third-class, no-class refugees. They're people on whom we've turned our back. We've said, your suffering doesn't matter. And no provision was made by our government to at least offer some kind of financial or other assistance to people who have been turned away or find themselves without perhaps hardly any resources in the States. And you know, it's important to point out that when we contrast that with the welcome that we have provided, a very good welcome that we've been providing to Ukrainians over the last year, when we contrast that situation with this one, it is deeply shocking, the totally unequal treatment. We've received already in 1 year 191,000 people from the Ukraine, but in the 6 years from January 2017, only 109,000 people have crossed at Roxham Road. Mm-hmm. And we're looking at close to 1 million applications from Ukrainians to come to this country. So I cannot but, you know, conclude that for Canada, these people who are coming here through Roxham, who are largely people of color, are not wanted here, that their suffering simply does not matter.
Thank you, Wendy, for that. And Katherine, I know as a youth being here, and then hearing about the expansion of the Safe Third Country Agreement, what are your thoughts? I mean, to folks who will not be able to, you know, practice their right, their human right, and you were able to actually cross the border and be here today.
It is unfortunate and it feels heavy to take in that. Like, I made it, but some other people that might be in the situation me and my family were will not be able to make it. Mm-hmm. It's really hard to process, I think. I also find that it's a little unfair as well, and I feel somehow privileged that the timing of things. But yes, overall, I think it's a little hard to wrap my head around the fact that, oh, there are some people that are experiencing the same things that my family and I were going through and won't have the chance to find safety and refugee and just a better life.
Thank you, Katherine, for sharing your story with us. So I see questions coming up in the chat, and I'll come back to folks again, to the panelists, but just wanted to touch upon some of the questions that have been posted. There's a question that there is a case with involvement of CCR, CCVT, and other Amnesty International and many other agencies with the Supreme Court of Canada. Is there any hope? And this is to any of the panelists. Alex, maybe if you want to start, and then Wendy, you can comment on that after.
I'm a very hopeful person, so I would like to think there is hope. I noticed, and I reviewed an article about the decision, and I saw some of the oral argument that the federal government defending the policy rested on the fact that, well, not everybody that gets sent back to the United States gets detained, that there is a process that some people get detained and some people don't. And just like in Canada, ignoring the fact that the detention rates are much higher in the United States. They talked about procedural safeguards that were in place for people who get turned back at the Canadian border, that there's an opportunity for them to appeal to the federal court. Even though the lawyers on the part of Canadian Council of Refugees and the Canadian Council of Churches pointed out how difficult in practice that appeals process is for somebody to challenge their removal under Safe Third Country Agreement. So I'm hopeful although I'm not on this legal team, I'm hopeful that we'll be able to demonstrate to the Supreme Court of Canada the precariousness of the US situation. I wanted to point out that a lot of that litany of immigration policies, anti-refugee immigration policies, a lot of people associate those with the Trump administration, when the fact is that many of those policies remain in place either because the Biden administration has tried to end them and has been unsuccessful in implementing its own policies, or because the Biden administration has turned around and just come up with their new version of the same anti-refugee policies, such as the third country transit ban, whereby people who don't demonstrate that they tried to apply for asylum in one of the countries they passed through on the way to the United States will be barred from getting asylum. So I'm hopeful that we can prevail before the Supreme Court, but I'm sort of an optimist.
Thank you for sharing that, Alex. We will remain optimistic. Hope. Wendy, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, well, I'm not a lawyer like Alex, my friend Alex, and I'm not so much of an optimist. And I do fear that the justices will somehow feel pressured and influenced by the government putting this in place before their judgment came down. I don't know. It's just a fear I have. And I did watch the proceedings on October 6th, and I can attest to what when the Canadian government lawyers were arguing about the procedural safeguards that are in place for someone who's excluded from Canada. I can relate from personal experience that we received emails from people who have been excluded from Canada, particularly during the pandemic border closure, who did not understand the papers that were given to them. It's legalistic gobbledygook. B, they did not understand that they could never apply for asylum again in Canada unless they took this 15-day window to somehow apply for judicial review. And I can tell you, for somebody in the States who doesn't even understand the papers they've been given, to find the resources to get a Canadian lawyer to make the appeal within that time frame is almost impossible. So there are no procedural safeguards at the border. That is farcical. And if
Thank you, Wendy. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm angry, I am angry.
Okay. Okay. Oh, thank you for mentioning that. I mean, the procedural safeguards, I mean, Alex, do you want to comment on that as a lawyer?
Well, supposedly there is an opportunity to apply for a stay of the removal. So let me give you an example of how it works. I have a client who had a very similar situation to the celebrated Rahaf case. So this is a woman who fled from a very oppressive country, from a very oppressive family, who felt that she was at risk of death if she was returned to her country. She came to the Canadian border, was given an opportunity to tell her whole story, and she was told that, well, unfortunately, you don't have an exception to the Safe Third Country Agreement. You don't have a family member in Canada, so we're going to return you, but you should appeal this, is what she was told by the officer, who seemed very sympathetic to her case. Probably no doubt recognizing that this person is identical to Rahaf, who was welcomed into Canada by the Minister of Public Safety or the Minister of Immigration, I can't remember. So when Canada wants to feel good or look good about their immigration process, they'll point to cases like Rahaf, or they'll point to the Ukrainians or the Syrians that they've brought into the country. But well, she was removed to the United States before she had an opportunity to even figure out how to contact the federal court after hours, request a stay of her removal. And she was promptly detained in the United States for 5 weeks before, somebody managed to bail her out and get her a bond, and she found her way to us. So that's, I think, how that describes sort of the illusory safeguards process that Wendy was speaking about. There's no phone number given to people, as I understand. There's no way for them to access the federal court after hours. They're not given access to a lawyer to navigate the process. So there really is no way for the federal court to intervene for somebody to challenge their removal to the United States under the Safe Third Country Agreement.
Okay. Thank you for that, Alex, and for clarifying that. I'm just going to take another question here. We only have 4 exceptions and really none to allow individuals from Africa to have an opportunity to come to Canada. Visas are difficult to acquire. What can be done to have an effective advocacy for this demographic? Anyone can answer.
I mean, what we've been asking for is to repeal the Safe Third Country Agreement or pull out of the Safe Third Country Agreement because of reasons like that. So some of the most desperate people who need the protection of Canada are not going to be able to get a visa. Maybe they'll get a visa to Mexico or Guatemala or Brazil. This is where a lot of them come in and walk their way up to the Mexican border, come into the United States somehow or other. This illustrates why the door is closed for people like that. So, really, I think the remedy would be for the repeal of the Safe Third Country Agreement. They don't have relatives in Canada if they don't meet any of the other exceptions, which I can maybe drop some of the exceptions into the chat so people can see. They're out of luck. And the only safety valve was that they could before go to Roxham Road, which was somewhat of a safe, orderly process where the RCMP would be waiting for them, and they could have entered Canada and made a claim. But of course, that possibility, as Wendy described, is not possible at this point.
Yeah.
And I would throw in just that the repeal of the Safe Third Country Agreement would permit people to enter Canada at any point along the border. So people would therefore naturally find themselves in provinces throughout the country. And so the political football that was created out of Roxham Road would simply not exist, because there wouldn't be this funnel of people coming in through Roxham, landing in Quebec. And so, that would be another huge benefit for the repeal of this agreement. And it would allow all of the provinces and perhaps even the territories to assume what is a national responsibility for offering refugee protection and considering the claims of people who come here seeking safety. However, I can't comment on this, the general question of people coming from African nations, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you for that, Wendy. I'm going to go to the next question. I'm looking for a story about a Yazidi genocide in Iraq to include in our upcoming book on genocide. Do you know anyone to write? So this is to a general question to everyone. So if folks...
where I am in Detroit, Windsor area, there's a large Iraqi population, large concentration. So I wouldn't be surprised if there was, I haven't encountered any yet, but if people there could connect folks to the Yazidi expatriate community. So I'd be happy to take that inquiry and try and connect people. Mbalu, you're muted still.
I'm just looking in the chat. If there's any more questions in the Q&A, any questions? I don't see any Q&A questions there, but there's a comment here in terms of an IRPAR section creates a 12-month bar. It's a comment for refused refugee claimants and does not appear to have the same exceptions for medical reasons and best interest of the child as under humanitarian and compassionate application. At the Canadian Centre to End Human Trafficking, we are concerned about the vulnerabilities of asylum seekers to trafficking during the period they're in Canada, pending determination of their application, when they are not allowed to work and are targeted for sex and labor exploitation. The more stringent refugee protection process will increase the risk of people being victimized by violence, smuggling, abusive practice, and trafficking. Any comments on this, Wendy, Alex, Catherine?
Well, sure. I mean, we're terribly concerned about the fact that we're now going to see people crossing into Canada, often in the hands of smugglers, or taking the initiative on their own to try to cross into Canada through dangerous terrains. I mean, after the protocol came into effect in our communities, which is a border community, we heard of 2 families who had crossed over onto the people's lands and were immediately intercepted and arrested by the RCMP. And of course, we know that last year at least 6 people died at the Canadian-US border, and now more recently the horrible case of this 8 people who have drowned in Akwesasne. So we will be seeing a great increase in the numbers of people attempting these dangerous crossings. And as you know, Audrey Macklin referred this as a job creation project for smugglers. And the fact that there is this a Kafkaesque requirement that if you manage to cross clandestinely into Canada, you have to remain undetected for 14 days before you can be allowed to make a refugee claim in Canada. And this leaves people in the hands of smugglers. And what on earth could happen to them during this period? We're, of course, very afraid that people will be subject to, exploitative forms of labor, for example, during that, or sex trafficking during that time period.
Thank you for that, Wendy. And despite all this terrible things that could potentially happen, what is fueling this seemingly global anti-refugee feeling, right? So someone commented that I am in the UK and it has become unspeakable. The PM has essentially said that refugee children can be abused in order to discourage people bringing them to the UK. So there's an anti-refugee rhetoric. Is this something new, or do you see that what's fueling this?
I hesitate to answer again and take up too much time. I happen to have spent 10 years working in more than that in the UK, working with unaccompanied refugee children in the UK and Europe. And what I see now, the willingness of the UK government to deport unaccompanied children when they become 18 is shocking to me, because we did actually manage through advocacy to put in place in the 1990s programs and safeguards for unaccompanied children at that time. So all I can say is, and I'm not an expert in this, is simply, this seems to be the zeitgeist that we are in. It's the movement. This is a global movement towards restriction, towards closure of borders, towards non-respect for refugee rights. And our government is clearly following along in that path. In a very, showing lack of leadership and creativity and courage.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Wendy. Katherine, do you want to comment on anything based on this comment?
Just taking back to the first question, and kind of piggybacking on what Ms. Wendy was saying, the more restrictions that are put and the more we close this ways of access for people to come to the country, I think the more ways people are trying to go around it to find refugee. After all, it's all people that are in very desperate conditions and people that are just trying to fight for their lives. So it's easy to fall prey to people with ill intent. And I think the more restrictions that are put regarding the borders that are being closed, the more we might see things like that happen. And it is sad and unfortunate.
Okay. There's another question as well, where the Safe Third Country Agreement has been in place for years. So why Canada rushed at this time? I guess it goes back to the anti-refugee rhetoric as well. And what are the differences with the past provisions? Is it a new provision or procedure for implementation? And Alex, if you can comment on that.
You mean like why is the door shut now as
Yeah.
in previous years? You know, I think the pandemic and the closure of the border at the pandemic sort of gave an opportunity for the Canadian government to think, oh, you know, if we can pull this off, we can pull this off. And I think in the political climate, I think, you know, the situation with a lot of these claims ending up in Quebec and the Quebec government taking a position that, well, this has to be stopped, these entries into Canada, and the opposition party in Canada clamoring for the Safe Third Country Agreement to be applied across the border, really made for a situation where the government, I think, out of expediency, decided they wanted to make this happen so they wouldn't lose an election. I mean, that's what I think happened. You know, what's different now than in previous years? I mean, I think the Trump administration numbers increased, but there were times before the Trump administration where numbers were higher than, and there were sort of ebbs and flows. But I think also the news media was focused on the issue and made it more of an issue. And then the pandemic closure caused a lot of pent-up demand. There were lots of people who needed to cross, wanted to cross, and couldn't cross because Canada was sending them back because of the pandemic closure. And when the borders reopened, of course, lots of people took the opportunity to come. And I think the attention focused on those large numbers created the political pressure, and it was a perfect storm. I think that's why it happened the way it did.
Mhm. And this question is for Katherine directly. What would have helped you when you first got here to Canada?
I think one of the main things is information. It seems like it's so hard to find the right resources, especially when you first come. We have family here that was kind of helpful, but I cannot believe people that don't have any family here, or maybe they're not as close with the family they have. So I think something helpful would have been just some guidance overall for the families and the people coming through the border. Just pointing to the right resources, legal resources, especially, that would have been great.
Thank you, Katherine, for sharing that. And there's another question in terms of how feasible is it to ask our US colleagues to influence the US administration to repeal their agreement? How feasible is it? Wendy and then Alex.
Well, Alex and I are members of a US-Canada cross-border network that was set up over 2 years ago to address, the issue of STCA issues. So we do work with them. We did at one point attempt to get a meeting with someone in the State Department of the US, but that never came about. But of course, Alex is much better placed to respond to that than I am.
Okay, Alex.
Funny enough, we thought that under the Trump administration, maybe we might be in a better position to push for that, because we could get the Americans realizing, well, why do we have an agreement where we're taking back people that we don't really want anyway? And we thought, paradoxically, maybe the time for the US to pull out of the Safe Third Country Agreement might have been during the Trump administration. But nevertheless, we have thought of strategies to come up with maybe letters from academics and service providers and prominent individuals calling for the United States to pull out of the agreement. It's been hard to articulate what arguments would be persuasive to the government. Telling the government that the US is not safe for asylum seekers.
Mhm.
Yeah, maybe, because maybe we could point out that, look, your professedly pro-immigrant administration is having difficulties even imposing its own policies, when states that are not favorable to immigrants can file suits in federal courts and stop, for example, the repeal of Title 42 or remain in Mexico, or can stop the government from implementing the Deferred Action Program. So we thought of that as one sort of a strategy to take. The other one would be calling for Canada to take on its fair share of its responsibility for hemispheric migrants. And I think that might be the stronger argument that we could use to convince the US government that, the Safe Third Country Agreement and this latest addition to it is allowing Canada to not pull its weight. despite the fact that, and I think this was pointed out to President Biden, Canada agreed supposedly to take on 15,000 refugees from the Americas. And you contrast that to the number of people that were crossing irregularly into Canada, and there were more people crossing in than 15,000. So how is Canada, by this agreement, taking on its fair share? I think that's where we have an opportunity to make it clear to the United States that this agreement is not in their interest.
Okay, thank you, Alex. And I just wanted to maybe if you can elaborate a little bit on the gender-based violence and racism and the idea of the U.S. being a safe country. Can you give us more information on that?
Sure. Well, I mean, I can give you some examples. Some of you may remember that there was what many called sort of a push for deportations in the closing days of the Trump administration. There were many African asylum seekers detained in Georgia and Louisiana, detained in facilities that were deliberately, by design, far away from places where they could find lawyers. And so a lot of these folks either had final removal orders, or maybe they were still on appeal towards the federal courts. And there were large numbers of them, especially from Cameroon, that were being put on planes and shipped out even after Biden became president. And the thoughts were like, why so many Black asylum seekers being shipped out? Why so many Black women? There were women that were deported that had claimed that they had been abused sexually and otherwise in detention. There was the allegations of a doctor that had performed unauthorized hysterectomies and other reproductive surgeries on women without their full consent. So this is an example where, yes, there is evidence. The Congressional Black Congress got involved and said, we need an inquiry into why so many Black asylum seekers were tempted to be pushed out of the country. You may remember that the first night of the Biden inauguration, he announced a 100-day pause on removals, and the idea was to be able to look into these allegations and then some southern states were able to intervene in the courts and get a federal court to say, no, you can't pause deportations for 100 days. And then, of course, the gender-based asylum cases that were in limbo for many years. The matter of AB case that really attempted to foreclose domestic violence as a reason for asylum has been overturned, but in a lot of respects, the damage has been done. And there's still a lot of uneven adjudication of those cases in the lower immigration courts.
Okay. Thank you, Alex. And I'm looking at the time. I'm going to take a few more questions and then we'll wrap up. I believe this is my question is, if you folks are aware that there are many people who came from Europe countries due to several reasons. However, when they asked asylum, they did not tell the truth that they came from Europe. Those people got protected as a permanent residence citizen, which is relief. I'm not sure. Anyone wants to comment on that?
No, I couldn't possibly comment on that. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Okay. However, 10 years later, those people have been asked to be refugee protection, which is very suffering mentally. Is there any hope for those people who stay in Canada as Canadian citizens? Okay. So another question is, how can ordinary people push back against this horribly racist decision and agreement? What should we do?
Well, I mean, in the short term, I would say there are protests happening, certainly both in Montreal and Toronto. There's ongoing protests in front of Prime Minister's office here in Montreal, and there's ongoing protests in front of Minister Mendicino in Toronto. So I think those are noonday protests. So that's one thing. There's the obvious thing about writing to your MPs and to the Prime Minister and expressing your outrage, signing petitions, all of those classic things that we can do. And I also think it's important to speak with your friends and family and neighbors about what is going on, to convey to them how the deep injustice of this and the unequal treatment we're affording Roxham Road refugees when compared the open door welcome we have provided to Ukrainians who are white Europeans. We have to draw that comparison. It's really, I feel it's really important. We have the resources to take in more people. We're a wealthy country. And on our website, I just want to say quickly, we do have 10 refugee myths and facts that address many of the false informations that circulated around people entering at Roxham Road. And people will no doubt bring up some of those points, as to why it was necessary to shut down this irregular entry point, so they can go to our website and find that information. But I think at this point we have to speak out. Really, that's the point where we're at right now.
Mhm. Thank you, Wendy. And Alex?
Yes, I just dropped in the link. Obviously, I think the protests are important. We need to raise our voices. I ordered a refugee flag, the orange and black flag that symbolizes the life vests that people are wearing trying to cross the Mediterranean, as a very poignant and visible symbol. And in terms of speaking to your representatives, I think keep in mind that the three major parties are all involved in this decision. The Conservatives clamored for the closure of Roxham Road. The government, through this secret deal that they signed a year ago and kept under wraps, managed to pull it off. But keep in mind, we have a minority government that's being propped up by the supply and confidence agreement by the NDP, which put out a statement saying that, that this is terrible. But I think we can maybe ask for stronger protests, stronger consequences. Like, why isn't this an issue that puts the government in jeopardy of losing their coalition? These are the thoughts that I have at this point in time.
Thank you, Alex. And Catherine, any comments on this before we wrap up?
I think one of the major things that, taking on what they were saying, is definitely talking with people, especially as someone that went through the experience and stuff like that, just sharing that with friends, family. At the end of the day, I believe that we're all, like, the people that we are receiving here are giving people value. I have many friends in medical field, many friends in human resources that are studying our university after they went through the whole process, and they just want to help and improve the country as well. There's many young people coming through these borders. They are the future. They are the development. So yes, that's my take on it.
Thank you, Catherine. And I see we have only about a minute, and being respectful of people's time. Just a reminder that the Refugee Rights Day Toronto Vigil, it's actually tomorrow at 4:30 p.m. at MP Marco Mendocino's office, 511 Lawrence Avenue West. So please join us tomorrow for the vigil. Come and sign a book of condolences and bring along a candle of flower to place on the altar to honor those being denied access to Canada. And just last question here that was put in, which I think is important, that we've heard that some Canadians are planning to do what they can as unpaid volunteers to help people stay safe while crossing, while waiting the 14 days. What are the legal ramifications for the volunteers?
It's a question that we've been endeavoring to find out the answer to that, but also we are hoping that, I know, for example, the Canadian Sanctuary Movement is, I believe, having discussions about how, for example, churches can provide sanctuary for people in this situation. And obviously anybody living in a border community along the US-Canada border may very well at some point be faced with this ethical question, whether if someone enters on your property and asks to be sheltered for that period of time.
Okay, thank you, Wendy. It's 1:30, and I see that there are some questions that were put in the chat. I'm sorry we could not get to all the questions, but we just wanted to thank everyone, and please do still be involved and engaged. And we look forward to seeing everyone tomorrow at the vigil at 4:30 p.m. And we just wanted to thank all of our panelists. If we can just give them a round of applause for engaging in this discussion with us, which is at a very difficult time. So thank you, Alex, Wendy, and Catherine for joining us, and for everyone spending your 12 noon time, 1 hour with us. Thank you so much, folks. See you all tomorrow at 4:30. Bye.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
See you tomorrow.
Great moderating, Mbalu. Thank you.